Hello, and welcome to this lecture on global environmental history. Let's start off by defining what environmental history is. So, environmental history studies the interactions between humans, culture, and nature. It really became a discipline in the 1960s and 70s as people became increasingly aware of environmental problems like pesticide pollution, ozone depletion, greenhouse gases, and so on. Historians began to look for the origins of contemporary problems in the past. Environmental history is a multidisciplinary subject that draws on ecology, geography, sociopolitical structures, and so on. And as with all history, narrative and storytelling is important. So let's talk about some influential environmental historians. And these are all American environmental historians, but there are environmental historians throughout the world, and we're only going to be talking about a few. So the first is Alfred Crosby. He was a historian at the University of Texas, Austin. He was very focused on Columbian exchange, or what he called ecological imperialism, which is the biology of invasions of European settlers to the New World. And this involved the introduction of European genetics, livestock, varmints or pests, pathogens that really decimated native populations, and many weeds. Donald Worster is another famous environmental historian. He was a professor at Kansas University. He puts a lot of focus on the transition from subsistence to capitalist agroecosystems. He addresses three clusters of issues: ecology, production, and ideas. With ecology, it's how has nature existed through time, including how has it affected us, the human population. For production, it's how we use or have used nature in a socioeconomic sense. An agroecosystem is an ecosystem that's organized for agricultural production, and a capitalist mode of production involves using land and the ecosystem and nature as a marketable commodity, whereas subsistence is just using it to feed your family and not really make a profit off it. And the idea aspect is how we think about nature, whether we see ourselves as part of nature or apart from nature, like separate from nature. Carolyn Merchant is another famous environmental historian. She was a historian at the University of California, Berkeley for many years. And so she really thought of humans and their interactions with nature and the environment as shifts. She really thought of shifts in the interactions between humans and nature as ecological revolutions. And ecological revolutions arise from tensions between production and ecology and between production and reproduction. And the result is that there's new constructs of nature, both materially and how we interact with nature and our perception of it. She built on Worster's concepts by saying that ecology now included both human and non-humans, and she expanded on the ideology aspect of his work by including both individual and group consciousness ideas about nature, and it to include all the senses. She also incorporated gender and the power structure of a society as integral components for environmental history. So the last environmental historian that we'll talk about is Donald Hughes. He was a professor at the University of Denver. He has several really easy to understand quotes. So the first is, environmental history is the study of human relationships through time with the natural commodities of which they are a part, in order to explain the processes of change that affect that relationship. Environmental history seeks to understand human beings as they have lived, worked, and thought in relationship to the rest of nature through the changes brought by time. As environmental historians, we are also interested in what people think about nature and how they have expressed those ideas in folk regions, popular culture, literature, and art. And it's important to remember that humans have only been on the planet for a very short amount of time. So this is the entire geologic history of the Earth here, shown on a clock face. And so the Earth formed 4.55 billion years ago, or 4,550 million years ago. And there was a long period of time when there was just no life at all, and then there was some life, but it was all unicellular. And then we saw multicellular life, and all these changes, and animals evolved, and then humans came onto the scene right here. The first hominins appeared about 2 million years ago. And so most of Earth's history, there were no humans. And yet, the small amount of time that we are here, we have changed it so much. It's actually akin to some of the great mass extinction events that have happened in Earth's geologic history. So humans have been here for just a fraction of the clock face, but we are affecting our environment tremendously. And the way that we see ourselves in or part of or apart from the environment has a big effect on how we interact with it. There's several major changes or milestones that have happened throughout human environmental history. The first was human evolution. Humans had to evolve for there to be a human environmental history. Next was the agricultural revolution, then the urban revolution, then the industrial revolution, then globalization, and then the information revolution and increased globalization. So over this time period, you can see that this is human population, was very, very low for most of that time. And then it really kicked up and started growing exponentially right around this time period. And that was when the Industrial Revolution happened. You've probably seen this figure before. It's an exponential increase in human population. This is that same graph, but we've transformed the y-axis to be on a log scale so that we can see some of the fine-tuned changes in the human population a little bit easier, but it takes away some of that dramatic exponential increase in the last several hundred years. So this is the same graph, this one back here, and this one, it's just that this is plotted on a log scale. And you can see that the y-axis, it's not a straight linear increase, it's on a log scale there. I will use this graph a little bit more because I think it shows some of the fine-tune things a little bit better and the changes in human population, but just understand that it's the same graph as this one here. So early on, humans were all hunter-gatherers. Most early hunter-gatherers are believed to have had very minimal impact on the environment. Some advanced hunter-gatherers may have killed off large megafauna that were struggling after the end of the last ice age, and some may have even manipulated forests to promote animal populations of choice. But all hunter-gatherers migrated to find food as climate changed and to follow herds that they depended on for food. And it's thought that hunter-gatherers really saw themselves as completely part of the nature that they used to harvest food. And we can see that even though that they were in this cave painting here, they're hunting an animal. In this cave painting here, the people are interspersed with the animals that they depended on for food. And so early hunter-gatherers, we think, saw themselves as part of nature. Next came the agricultural revolution, sometimes called the Neolithic Revolution. This occurred about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. It coincided with the end of the last ice age, and that translated to a more stable and favorable environment for growing crops. It first occurred in the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, which is right here. And people there had fields of wild annual grasses and tubers that they figured out that they could collect the seeds from and throw out again. This allowed people to permanently settle and to observe and experiment with plants, and they learned how to grow and develop more plants. The Fertile Crescent was by no means the only agricultural revolution. There were several other agricultural revolutions throughout the globe. And then from these areas where people started planting crops, the technology would then spread out to other areas. But you can see that there were several in the Americas. There was one in the Middle East here, and then there was one in the Far East as well. And so the technology then spread out to different regions. But the very first agricultural revolution, we think, took place in the Fertile Crescent. So domestication is the process by which farmers selected for desirable traits by breeding successive generations of plant or animals. A domestic species becomes different from the wild relative over time. And Neolithic farmers selected crops that could be harvested easily for a given location. So wheat was really common in the Fertile Crescent, rice and millet was common in Asia, squash and corn were common in Mexico. And farming was small and subsistence-based at first, but it grew and it started supporting larger and larger populations. As time went on, people were able to domesticate other plants and animals depending on the location and the amount of water available. And that's important because reliance on a monocrop would not have improved human health. And it's thought that farmers began to see themselves as separate from plants and animals for the first time in human history. Plants and animals were now objects to be manipulated for the survival of humans, not just hunted and used, but actually manipulated and cultivated and controlled. The environmental impacts of agriculture were things like manipulating water for irrigation, deforestation to create these permanent settlements and also to clear forests to plant crops in, soil erosion and degradation, and also waste generation, because as people concentrated in certain areas, they produced a lot more waste. But the benefits were that groups were able to support more people and were able to accumulate material goods, surpluses of food for stability, and then this food could be stored and sold, and urbanization became more practical. There were several drawbacks, though. In addition to the environmental impacts of things like deforestation and destruction of natural habitats, there was also overgrazing. Urbanization created that waste and sewage, increasing air and water pollution, and a spread of disease. Also, the increase in goods led to increased waste and pollution, and conflicts started to arise over land ownership and power, and the survival of wild plants and animals became less important to people. The next really big event in human environmental history was the urban revolution, and this is the development of civilizations or city states. Agriculture transformed societies during the next few millennia. Small, kin based agricultural villages transformed into large, complex urban societies. There were several prominent Bronze Age kingdoms and civilizations, but communities went from hundreds of people to thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people as city states developed. And today there are cities with millions of residents in them. The largest ancient civilization was the Indus civilization, and that was around 3300 to 1300 BCE. It extended over more than 386,000 square miles, that's 1 million square kilometers, across the plains of the Indus River. At its peak, it may have accounted for 10% of the world population at that time, with the largest cities containing 30,000 to 60,000 people. The process of urbanization happened at different times for different parts of the world. The physical consequences of urbanization were higher population densities, a division of labor, a greater sense of security and wealth for some, a greater need for potable water and food that's drinkable water, concentration of human wastes, increased infection due to higher population densities and concentration of human waste, increased infection due to higher population densities and a concentration of human waste, and innovation provided means to move water and wastes around, which intensified agriculture. With urbanization, people increasingly saw themselves as separate from nature. Nature really just consisted of resources to be used, and a lot of people didn't live close to nature anymore. They lived in a very developed society. Rather, people didn't really live in nature or as close to nature anymore. Some societies saw wilderness as a refuge from oppressors. So, one such oppressor was the Egyptian pharaoh for some people. And so they would run to nature to escape from it, but still, wilderness was seen as a place of hardship that had monsters or evils in it. And so they didn't see themselves as part of nature anymore. Many saw it as their role to overcome nature, dominate it, cultivate it, and make it suitable for human habitation. The human population continued to increase, and certain civilizations expanded and conquered other civilizations. This increased densities and led to many epidemics, such as leprosy and the Black Death or the plague. The demand for resources, increased pollution, and waste continued as the human population grew. The Roman Empire expansion was an example of one civilization expanding and taking over others, and it was partly driven by environmental degradation and resource shortages. The Mediterranean basin was largely deforested 2,000 years ago, and grain shortages led Rome to conquer more territory to feed a growing Roman population. There was further environmental change that was caused by Romans or spurred by Romans. This included the extensive network of roads that they built that fragmented landscapes and concentrated travelers, the crops and livestock that they introduced throughout the world, and the agricultural tools that went with them, deforestation, mining, and increased urban settlements, which concentrated again garbage, air pollution. There was lead poisoning now due to pipes, and the first sewer system, which dumped waste into rivers. So there were a lot of short and long term consequences of both the agricultural revolution and urbanization, and so I've just summarized them here on this slide. The good things were that there was more food for people, so people had food security, and that allowed them to survive from childhood to adulthood and to have children that survived. It supported larger populations. Life expectancy increased. There was a higher standard of living for many people. There was formation of villages, towns, and towns and cities served as centers for trade, government, and religion. But there were a lot of bad things that went along with these revolutions as well. The destruction of wildlife habitats and clearing of forests and grasslands was definitely a negative. These revolutions also resulted in the killing of wild animals, feeding on grass and crops, and fertile lands were turned into desert by livestock overgrazing. Soil also eroded into streams and lakes, and towns and cities concentrated wastes and pollution and spread diseases. There was increased armed conflict and slavery over ownership of regions, and people increasingly saw themselves as separate from nature and the wilderness as bad. So we've mentioned pollution in a lot of ways, and in 1661 was the first time that air pollution was really recognized as harmful. So in 1661, John Evelyn published a pamphlet calling to clean up the air of the city of London. The population of London in the 1660s was around 350,000 people. In his pamphlet, John Evelyn described the health effects of air pollution caused by coal burning, and he suggested that burning wood instead of coal would be less harmful to the lungs, and he called for relocating some of London's more polluting industries outside of London. Now, shortly after this, the Industrial Revolution occurred in full force. This began after agricultural societies became more industrialized and urban in Europe in the 1700s, and then in the US in the 1800s. There was a shift from wood to coal as a fuel source, and as John Evelyn pointed out, coal puts a lot more pollutants into the atmosphere than wood does. There was a lot of innovation in terms of manufacturing and creating machines that could manufacture, and there was a big shift in dependence from human-based production to machinery-based production. The Industrial Revolution really depended on machinery, and accompanying this was a more wasteful attitude. So there were a lot of pollutants that were created, wastes that were just dumped into waters or into the air, and people didn't care because they treated nature as a common good that could just be used for production, harvested as much as they want, polluted as much as they want. So there was noise pollution, dirt pollution, hazardous conditions for the workers that worked the machines. And at this time, we began to understand bacterial infections as well, and understand chemistry and chemical composition. With the Industrial Revolution, there became an even greater separation of humans from nature in their consciousness. So the benefits were really that there was mass production of affordable products, an increase in agricultural productivity, lower infant mortality rate, longer lifespan, a decrease in population growth, better health, population control and education because people are more educated, greater average income and old age security. But the drawbacks were that all of our resource problems and environmental problems of today really came from the industrialization of societies. So people began to recognize during the Industrial Revolution that pollution and waste was an issue. And London began regulating toxic waste that was dumped into the Thames by gas manufacturers in the city. Frederick Engels published The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, outlining how untreated sewage created awful odors and turned rivers green in industrialized cities. And Britain passed the Alkali Acts in 1863 to regulate the gaseous hydrochloric acid production that was produced by these gas manufacturers. And many grassroots movements began identifying and demanding action regarding environmental degradation and pollution. So some of the grassroots groups included the Coal Smoke Abatement Society. So notably, the Coal Smoke Abatement Society was formed in 1891 and is one of the oldest non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. So the Industrial Revolution was really made possible by a reliance on fossil fuels, which included coal and oil. And in 1859, the first oil well was drilled with mechanical power. This was using a steam engine in Pennsylvania. And this really shifted from a coal economy to an oil economy, and it made the automobile possible. There were other oil wells that were drilled before this, but this was the first one that was drilled using mechanical power, and so it really streamlined the process of drilling for oil and extracting oil. And so energy history, transportation history, and climate history is a very important intersection for many environmental historians. So the good and the bad of the Industrial Revolution. The good was that there was mass production of useful and affordable products, a higher standard of living for many, greatly increased agricultural production, lower infant mortality, longer life expectancy, increased urbanization, and a lower rate of population growth because people were more educated. The bad was that there was increased air pollution, increased water pollution, increased waste. There was soil depletion and degradation, groundwater depletion, habitat destruction and degradation, and biodiversity depletion. And throughout all this, people, again, began to see themselves as even more separate from nature. It was very common for people to live completely in these urban environments and never go out and be in nature during their whole lives. So the next big step in human environmental history is globalization. Globalization speeds up movements and exchanges across the planet, and it overlaps with the Industrial Revolution and was made possible and actually demanded by it. The population continued to increase, and connectedness across the planet increased. The Columbian Exchange is an example of globalization. Christopher Columbus landed in North America in 1492, And the Columbian Exchange is the transfer of plants, animals, culture, human population, technology, diseases, and ideas from the Old World, Europe, to the New World, North America. When the Europeans came to North America, there was widespread deforestation and resource use, and an estimated 90% of Native Americans, that's 55 million people, died between 1492 and 1600 due to diseases alone. The frontier era from 1600 to 1890 is part of this globalization. The Americas had many different groups of Native Americans with distinct societies and ways of living based on available resources and climates. For example, Native Americans in the Northeast had very different ways of living than those on the plains or in the Great Basin. Some were nomadic, some were stationary, some had innovations like agriculture, irrigation, etc., that sustained permanent settlements, while others followed migrating animals around. The Europeans began to come to North America and settled and then expanded west. The population of the nation grew from 7.25 million people to more than 23 million people from 1812 to 1852. This painting by Henry Lewis was painted in 1846, and it depicts Americans moving onto the unknown frontier. Thousands of pioneers pulled away from cities like St. Louis, said farewell to civilization as they left the Mississippi River and headed across the unsettled plains to Oregon in the 1840s. During the frontier era, government-owned land was given or sold cheaply to railroad, timber, and mining companies, or to land developers, schools, universities, and homesteaders to encourage westward movement. There was this idea of manifest destiny at the time, which was a belief in the 19th century that American settlers were destined to expand across North America. The view of these European settlers was that the continent was untamed wilderness with endless resources to be conquered by white Europeans. Whereas many Native American groups that the Europeans interacted with saw the land as a communal thing and were fairly good stewards to it. Now, again, I don't want to generalize to all Native Americans because there was an incredible diversity of Native Americans or indigenous people in the Americas at the time, but many that the Europeans first interacted with on the East Coast saw the land as a communal thing, and that you only owned the land that you were actually farming at that time. And once your crops were gone, you didn't own that land anymore. So what Europeans actually did was use up the resources in areas, and then when they used up those resources, they moved west to find more resources. They also displaced and killed many Native Americans as they did so. This painting by John Gast in 1872 shows an allegorical female figure, America, leading pioneers in civilization westward. And this is a symbol of the unabashed American expansionism policy of Manifest Destiny, espoused by Andrew Jackson. So this female embodiment of America here is the embodiment of light in the darkness of the wilderness and is bringing different forms of economic activity and transportation with her across America to the west. Now, globalization has really happened all over the planet. It's a global thing. And the idea of the frontier era also happened in other countries as well. Colonists came to Australia in 1788. Humans first arrived in Australia 60,000 years ago, and the indigenous Australians hunted and modified the landscape with fire, something called fire stick farming, where they regularly burned vegetation. This allowed germination of plants that were needed to increase the carrying capacity of the local environment for browsing and grazing animals. The short-term benefits were that it facilitated hunting, controlled weeds, and so on. Long-term, it turned dry forest into savanna, and it completely changed the ecological makeup of that ecological community there. So that's how the indigenous Australians lived. And then colonists came to Australia in 1788. So Captain Cook first mapped Australia in 1770, but then in 1788, the first convict fleet arrived from England. European settlers brought drastic agricultural and industrial changes to the environment and rapidly modified the landscape. Similar to the Americas, colonizers saw the land as theirs to dominate. In 1850, a result of globalization was the plowing of the world's grasslands. This began in 1850. It continued on for several decades. Grasslands were plowed to grow grain for the world's increasing urban population. It first began in the Eurasian steppe, which is present-day Russia and Ukraine. In the 19th and 20th century, the plow-up spread to the Great Plains of North America, the belt of southern Africa, lands in Australasia, northern India, North Africa, and the plains of Hungary and Romania. The Great Plow-up was really driven by the transport revolution, railroads, cargo ships, ports, etc., and demanded by the world's growing population. Unfortunately, indigenous populations were forcibly driven off many lands, and there were many ecological disasters that occurred following the plow up, such as the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. The next big shift in human environmental history was the information revolution and further globalization, and this occurred in the mid 1900s. The information revolution describes current economic, social, and technological trends post industrial revolution, and it's due to semiconductor technology. It led to increased globalization so that many industries were operating on a global scale. It has led to an increase in the consumption of products, which has increased the production of goods, which has put further stress on the environment. And then finally, we have the Great Acceleration. This is a sharp increase in the human population, economic activity, resource use, transportation, communication, and science since World War II. And again, this was a product of changing technology. And throughout all this time, people have seen themselves as more and more separate from nature. Thank you.